Hello, the presentation will begin shortly. Please submit your questions to the question and answer window. Today's presentation will be in English. To use the French interpretation channel, click the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. See you in a few minutes. Thank you. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for Safety and Health Week. And today's session will be on championing trans-inclusive workplaces. I am Sue Freeman, your moderator for today. To begin, a few Zoom items. Please submit all questions in the question and answer option at the bottom of your Zoom window. Today's webinar is also offered in French. If you want to access the interpretation channel, you will find an interpretation icon option at the bottom of your Zoom window where the globe icon is, or where it says more. We put instructions in the chat as well. A recording of the event will be available on our YouTube channel in the days ahead. We will email you when it is available. Before we begin, we would like to offer a land acknowledgement. The Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, CCOHS, is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. A few words about CCOHS. We are Canada's national resource for the advancement of workplace health and safety. For more than 40 years, CCOHS has promoted the physical and psychological health, safety, and well-being of workers. I'd like to welcome Dani Gomez-Ortega here to speak with us today. Dani is a diversity and inclusion champion with a passion for empowering others to create more inclusive spaces. Currently, she leads the development of strategies and projects that remove barriers to success for 200,000 employees across Canada. She sits on the board of directors for Dignity Network Canada, an organization that advocates for the rights of 2SLGBTQ+ people. Previously, Dani has had a number of leadership roles in community organizations like Pride House TO, Toronto PFLAG, and Outnet Toronto. Her contributions have been recognized through various awards, including the Bill 7 Award, Ryerson University Student Leadership Award, and most recently, the Janice Waddell Collegiality Award. Dani's work and commitment to inclusion are shaped by her experience as a Latinx immigrant transgender woman with an invisible disability. Welcome, Dani.
Thank you so much, Sue, and thank you so much, CCOHS, for inviting me. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you to talk about how to create trans-inclusive spaces. I also just want to thank all of you who are here, who are watching, for making the time for this really, really, really important topic. And the hope is that through your learnings, you can feel empowered to create more inclusive spaces in your workplace. So again, thank you, Sue, and I hope that everybody takes something away from this session. And so just a few guidelines around how we're going to be using the space. This is a learning space. We are all learning, including myself. So just keep that in mind, that we're all learning. We're just at different parts of that learning journey. Additionally, I want to encourage you to ask questions. So through the chat, through the Q&A, please do ask questions that we can take up at the end. And then also do participate. Now, you might see a couple of stars there when it comes to the questions I'm participating. When it comes to the questions, I encourage questions about the research that I will chat about. I encourage questions about my lived experience as a transgender person, questions that I'm not comfortable with, or questions about my body. And when it comes to participating, I really want to encourage you to participate to the best of your capacity. I know that the world is on fire. I know that there's many things happening at home, at work. So if you need to listen to this webinar while you're washing dishes, taking care of kids, taking care of dogs, that's 100% okay. The last piece that I'm going to mention is to find comfort in the discomfort. In today's conversation, you might hear ideas that are new, which might create a little bit of discomfort. That's normal. I see these conversations like a workout. So when I am working out, I am sweaty, I am in pain, I am uncomfortable, but it's good for me. Same thing applies here. When it comes to learning about these topics, you will sometimes be sweaty, you sometimes will be uncomfortable, you sometimes will even be in pain, but know that it's good for you. If you're uncomfortable, it only means that you're expanding those DEI muscles. And so with that said, we have a packed agenda. I'm going to share a little more about myself. We're going to talk about some terms and definitions. We're going to address why this conversation is important. Then we're going to look at some of the challenges that trans people might be facing in your workplace. And last but not least, we're going to be talking about taking action. I also just want to highlight that the session that you're going to be seeing today is usually a 90-minute, 2-hour session, which we are compressing into 25 to 30 minutes. So if you hear me speaking a little bit fast, that's why I'm trying to compress 90 minutes into 25 concise and great minutes. So with that said, a little bit more about me. I've been doing this work for about 10 years. I actually currently work in a global company, and we're present in 55 countries. So I am getting exposed and learning about what diversity, equity, and inclusion looks like in different parts of the world, and how we can use strategies and modify them to make sure that DEI can come to life, depending on what context they're in. I also have a disability. I have ADHD, and I'm also on the autism spectrum. So if I trip on my words, I usually am able to come back. Or if I lose track of what I'm saying, I'm usually able to come back. So just keep that in mind. I was born in Venezuela. I live in Toronto. I've been in Toronto now for about 20 years. And I currently live with Lucky and Luisa, who are my 2 dogs, 2 Chihuahuas, and also my fiance Joel, who you can see on the screen. Lucky and Luisa are from Texas. They're both rescues. Lucky just wants his food, and Luisa just wants to play. So it's a very, very, very interesting household, as you can imagine. Now, terms and definitions. I want you to look at the screen and tell me what terms are unfamiliar to you. Maybe just highlight them to yourself. So I'll read them aloud because they understand for translation purposes. So we have gender identity, gender expression, transgender, cisgender, gender diversity, non-binary, social transition, medical transition, legal transition, dead name, best practices of pronouns, intersectionality, and intentional inclusion. Right now, just take note of which ones of these are new to you. That way you can pay especially close attention to those particular ones. So again, take a quick moment, highlight the ones that are new to you, and pay especially close attention to those. And so first, I want to talk about the difference between sex, gender, and gender expression, and also sexual orientation. So orientation, that's your heart, right? That's who you're attracted to. Excuse me. So orientation, sexual orientation, the words that we use are gay, bisexual. That's who you're attracted to. Okay, let's put that aside for now. When we talk about sex, we're talking about biological characteristics. We are talking about chromosomes. We are talking about reproductive organs. In short, we're talking about what's in people's pants. And so based on certain characteristics, we label people as male, female, and sometimes intersex, as some people are born with chromosomes or parts that are neither exclusively male or neither exclusively female. So that's sex. Sex is what's in people's pants. We don't want to talk about sex because, again, it's private. People shouldn't really know about your sex, again, because it's private, it's in your pants. You don't really see sex also. It's important to note that when you look at somebody, you don't see their sex, you can only guess, because again, you don't know what's in their pants. Now let's talk about gender. Gender is the way that we see ourselves. That lives in our mind, right? So do we see ourselves as a man, as a woman, as non-binary? And we'll unpack that in a second. And again, gender, since it lives in our brain, we can't really see it. We can guess somebody's gender, but we can't really see it. It's only a best guess. What we do see is gender expression. How are they expressing themselves? Are they wearing feminine clothes? Are they looking more masculine? Do they have a dress? Do they have a beard? Right? And so the only thing that we know for sure when we look at somebody is their gender expression. And so words that we use to describe gender expression are masculine, feminine, and androgynous. Androgynous means that it's neither masculine or feminine, it's kind of somewhere in the middle. So I just want to highlight that because we never really know from the root. We can take a guess, right, based on a gender expression, but we don't really know sex or gender. So it's really, really, really important for us to just acknowledge that we don't really know for sure. We can only do a best guess, which is why it's important to try not to guess. And it's good to ask people pronouns so you don't get it wrong. And we'll talk a little more about pronouns in a second. And again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Please put them in the Q&A. We'll take it up towards the end. Now, transgender and cisgender. You probably know transgender. That's me, right? When I was born, the doctor said, it's a boy. But he got it wrong because I identify as a woman. So it's transgender, somebody whose gender identity does not align with the gender that they were assigned at birth. Cisgender is somebody like my mom. So when my mom was born, the doctor said, it's a girl. And he got it right, because as far as I know, she identifies as a woman. And so my guess is that most of you are cisgender. What does that mean? Most of you have a gender identity that is aligned with the gender that you were assigned at birth. Why are these terms important? We typically say trans people and normal people, or trans people and everybody else. Let's not do that. We're all normal. We're just different. So it's trans people and cisgender people. Trans women and cis women, cisgender women. Again, language matters. Language matters. So this is one that might be new to you that you might identify with. Now, when we talk about gender diversity, we have to talk about what we learned in school, which wasn't much. What we learned in school was that there was men and there was women. And that's it, right? Then we started learning that there was man, there was woman, and there was like a spectrum where there were some people that identify somewhere in between. Those people might use words like non-binary to describe themselves. People identify as a mix of both man and woman, or neither. Now, however, when we learn about gender like a galaxy, right? In a galaxy, there's a lot of stars. We're discovering different ones every day. Same thing when it comes to gender. So when it comes to gender, there's man, there's woman, but there's also two-spirit from indigenous communities. There's a Hijra people, which is a third gender in India. There's a Muhe people in Mexico. And so there's actually a lot more genders out there than we can imagine, and we're discovering more every day. And so when we talk about somebody that is non-binary, gender variant, gender non-conforming, or even a third gender, it's somebody who's neither a man or a woman, but somewhere in between or neither. Why is this important? Think about the washrooms in your office. Washrooms are typically for men, and then there's washrooms for women. What about non-binary people? Where do they go? Right? And so it's important to acknowledge that the way that our workplaces are built only acknowledges two genders. Well, actually, there's a lot more out there to recognize that are actually being accidentally excluded. So just keep that in mind, that the world is really built for two genders, which means that many other genders are accidentally excluded. And that leaves some work for us to do. Sorry, I need to have a quick drink. Excuse me for a second. Please remember to stay hydrated yourself. Have a lot of water. Now let's talk about transitioning, gender transitioning. We used to think that transitioning was just one step. People went through all these surgeries and ta-da, they're a new person, right? That's not the case. There's different stages to transitioning. That's really good for you as occupational health people to just be mindful of. The first one is the social transition. So that is when we tell people who we are. We might be changing our clothes, our hair, our facial hair. So again, it's just those things that are easy to change. And at this point, when it comes to accommodations, we usually just need people to acknowledge our pronouns and our new names, etc. We might use a new uniform, we might use a new washroom, and so on. Medical transition is when we go to a doctor to seek some gender-affirming care. So that might be hormones, surgeries, etc. Now, it's important to just acknowledge that when it comes to medical transition, not every trans person goes through it. Not every trans person feels they need the help of a doctor to be themselves. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I also want to acknowledge that it's challenging to go through a medical transition in terms of access. Many people don't have access to a doctor, which we'll talk to a little more later. But again, just to be mindful that medical transition, depending on where you are in the country, can be quite challenging to find a doctor who can help you through it. Also, those surgeries are typically not covered by insurance. So surgeries around medical transition do cost quite a bit of money, which requires workplaces, and many workplaces are actually looking at their benefits to see if they can cover some of those costs. Last but not least, the most painful one is the legal transition. So that is changing our ID, changing our passport, changing the name and our gender on those things. It is a pain in the butt. Just imagine changing your name on your passport right now. Where do you even begin? I have been going through the process of changing my legal documents for the past 3 years, and I am still not done. It is expensive, it is complicated, it is cumbersome, it is overwhelming, which is why a lot of trans people have outdated ID. Now, the outdated ID might have our dead name. Our outdated ID might have the name that we were given at birth that we no longer identify with. It's really important to know that hearing our dead name, seeing our dead name can be painful. It reminds us of a time of our life that we weren't happy at all because we had to hide who we truly were. And so some workplaces are like, well, we need to call you what your ID says. Do not do that. Do not do that. Changing our IDs is almost close to impossible. And so it's really important for us to honor the name that people tell us they choose. It's also important to just notice that a lot of people change their name and don't use the name that they were given at birth, regardless of whether they're trans or not. And we still respect those chosen names either way. And again, you might be thinking, well, Dani, why don't people just change their ID? It is expensive, it is cumbersome, it is complicated, you need lawyers. And I've been going through it for 3 years, and I'm extremely privileged, and I'm still going through it. My passport still has my dead name, and I have a beard on there. No, it's not easy. It's not easy. Now, when it comes to pronouns, it's the bare minimum that we can do for trans people, right? Some people use he pronouns, some people use she pronouns, some people use they, some people use a mix of all those, all right? And that's okay. For me, for example, I use she, her, and they, them. You can choose whichever one you want to use for me when it comes to those 4 that I just gave you. Hearing the wrong pronoun hurts, right? It is a paper cut on top of 1,000 other paper cuts that we've been receiving throughout our life. Hearing the wrong pronoun hurts. It feels like a kick in the gut. Our fight or flight gets activated, right? And when it comes to health and safety, our health is hurt when we hear the wrong pronoun. It's also important to know that people have the legal right to choose their own pronoun. Companies across Canada have been fined upwards of $30,000 for not respecting people's pronouns. You might start seeing people sharing their pronouns more often, especially cisgender people. Why? When cisgender people share their pronouns, it creates a space where less assumptions are made. It creates a space where people pause before they assume somebody's pronoun. Now, it's good to invite people to share their pronouns, never force them, right? Invite people to share their pronouns, never force them. There's reasons why they may not want to share their pronoun. It could be something around privacy. It could be around their political beliefs. It could be around them not using me pronouns, and that's okay. Second, last but not least, you stay there for everyone unless you know their pronoun, right? That's what I do. Regardless of who I meet, I use they, them until I see the pronoun somewhere, until I ask them, or they share with me, or I see it in the signature. And last but not least, when it comes to pronouns, it is not a preferred pronoun. It's not a preference. It just is. Now, let's go to our last two terms. The first is intersectionality. So what intersectionality tries to explain is that when it comes to identity, we don't live in bubbles. It's not like Black people are over here, and trans people over here, and disabled people over here. People's identities overlaps. And when identities overlap, things get tougher. And so that means that if you know people who are, let's say, trans and Black and disabled, they might be experiencing a lot of barriers. And so it's good to keep an eye on those people who have intersectional identities. The last one is intentional inclusion. And what that tries to explain is that if we're not actively trying to include people, we are by default excluding them. For example, if we are not actively building washrooms that are for all genders, we are by default excluding a whole bunch of people who don't identify as a man or a woman, right? And so inclusion takes intentional action. Otherwise, you might be accidentally excluding people. And so moving on, and I know that I'm moving quite fast, but I hope you're keeping up. And you're always welcome to ask more questions after this if you have more questions. But why is this conversation important? The first one is that it's connected to this week, right? Trans inclusion is connected to workplace safety and psych safety. What is psych safety? Psych safety is feeling comfortable and safe, speaking up, sharing our opinion, disagreeing with the group. And guess what? If trans people don't feel safe doing that, that might put everyone at risk. How? Imagine a manufacturing plant. If a trans person doesn't feel safe to report a safety issue because they feel like they will be punished, that puts everybody in danger, right? And so when it comes to safety, keeping trans people safe keeps everybody else safe. And when trans people are not safe, that could hurt everybody else. There's also a piece around prevalence. Believe it or not, believe it or not, in the US, 12% of young people, that is late teens to early 30s, identify as trans or non-binary. 12%. That's not just 1 or 2 or 3 people that are trans. That's a lot of people, a lot of young people that are either already in the workplace or coming in, right? And so being mindful of this community's needs is being mindful of a large population that's currently in the workplace or making their way in. I also want to say that if you think you don't have trans people in your workplace, that means that they're not safe, that they don't feel safe speaking up, right? So if you're like, oh, well, we don't have any trans people. Actually, you do. You probably do. According to stats, you probably do. Just don't feel safe revealing themselves. There's also a piece around increasing hate. So it is important to just acknowledge that across the right now, for some reason, there is a global rise in anti-trans hate. Violence is going up in Canada, in the US. In Canada, there's been some efforts to limit the rights of trans people. In the US, for example, there's some states where I can't use the women's washroom. And so it's really important to know that hate is increasing. And unless you nip it in the bud right now in your companies, it's only going to get worse. And last but not least, it's the law, right? When it comes to harassment, the definition of harassment is repeated and persistent behavior that torments, undermines, or frustrates people. So if somebody's constantly dead naming a trans person, if they're constantly using the wrong pronoun on purpose, that can be considered and should be considered harassment. And that is against the law. Now, what are some of those challenges that trans people and non-binary people might be facing in your workplace? First one is documentation, right? As I mentioned, it's really hard for us to have documentation that matches our identity. And so, for example, for me, I have been prevented from going into buildings because they think that I stole somebody's ID. So again, really, really, really mindful to just be, really important to be mindful of that. There's also a piece around employment barriers. So when it comes to trans people, we are 4 times more likely to earn $10,000 or less. 50% felt they have been rejected from a job because of being trans. 17% have turned down a job because it was not safe or trans positive. And so even getting a job and keeping a job is really hard for us. Why? Because people think there's something wrong with us, right? So that's a really big one when it comes to your recruiters, when it comes to your talent acquisition. They often act as a barrier for trans people to come to the workplace. There's a piece around healthcare. So for example, in Ontario, there's been research that says that 40% of those family doctors have been ridiculed, refused care, or subject to discriminatory behavior. 21% don't go to the ER out of fear of being ridiculed or harassment, and 10% have been outright denied care. What does that mean for you specifically? If something happens in the workplace, you send people to the hospital. Guess what? Trans people may not feel safe at the hospital, at least not on their own. So you might want to send somebody with them to keep them company and to make sure that nothing wrong happens to them, to make sure that they're respected and valued. There's a piece around safety in public. So we are a lot more likely to experience violence from the age 15. And because of that, 2/3 of us avoid being in public spaces. 2/3 of us avoid being in public spaces. That means public transit, that means the workplace, that means the office, that means the mall. And so it's really important to just be mindful that there's a lot of anxiety when it comes to us being out in public because of that harassment that we face often. Also, when it comes to that piece around safety in public washrooms, 51% of us avoid using public washrooms. Why? Well, which washroom should I go to? Should I go to the men's where I could be harmed and beat up? Or should I go to the women's where they could call the police on me because they think that I'm a monster who's there to get them? Right? And so the washrooms can even be a scary place for us. And we always have to do the math. Okay, where are we going to be safest? Where are we going to be safest? We're always doing that math. There's a piece around housing discrimination. Many of us lose our homes and still have to go to work the next day. We lose our homes because of rejection from our families, from our landlords. I've experienced homelessness twice, and I still have to show up to work the next day. So, what services do you have in your workplace that support people, support workers who might be experiencing homelessness? There's a piece around targeted violence, and I think, and a piece to highlight around targeted violence is that about 1/3 of us about a quarter of us have been harassed by police. And so when there's an incident, what do you call? The police. Well, it's just good to be mindful that trans communities don't have a great relationship with police, and we might be quite scared of them. And so it's important, if you do call security, if you do call police, if you do have to include them, then make sure that somebody else is there to make sure that trans people are not harmed. And last but not least, there's a piece around interpersonal violence. 96% of us have heard that we're not normal. Every day on the media, I read at least one piece of media that says that there's something wrong with us, that we're monsters trying to get your children, that you should be scared of us, that we are mistakes. Something that I've been hearing my whole life, something that we hear very often. Additionally, 78% of us report that our families have been hurt or embarrassed. So it's not just us, right? If you make a transphobic comment, you could be hurting that somebody who loves us, right? Our parents, our sisters, our cousins, our best friends. And last but not least is that 67% of us feared that we would die young. For a long time, I didn't imagine, I didn't dream that I would live past 30, let alone reach 31, which is how old I am right now. I thought max I would make it to 27 and that would be the end for me because of how tough the world is to trans people. And so what does this create? This has created very high numbers of depression in our community, very high numbers of self-harm, very high numbers of drug abuse, and unfortunately, very high suicide numbers. We have lost many in our community. We have lost nurses, we have lost teachers, we have lost people who could have had a great impact on our community just because the world was not kind to them. However, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Having supportive adults in our life can decrease suicide attempts by 40%. I'll repeat that. Having supportive adults in our life can decrease suicide attempts by 40%. That means that by being somebody who's supportive, you're keeping people alive, right? What does that mean for all of us? We have the power to keep people alive just by being inclusive. And so when it comes to trans inclusion, it's not about being politically correct. It is not even about being nice. It is about keeping people alive. And you have the power to keep people alive just by being inclusive. You have the power to keep people alive just by being inclusive. And it's a heavy one. Hope that you can take it and leave that with you for a while. Now, taking action, you might be itching now, like, okay, Dani, how do we do it? How do we show support? How do we keep people alive? This is one of my favorite videos that I encourage you to just watch with me for a couple of seconds and really ask yourself two questions. Number one, what's being done to be inclusive? And number two, what impact did it have? So two questions for you. What was done to be inclusive and what impact did it have? All right, here we go.
Hi. No. Hi, I'm Taylor. Hi, I'm here for my interview.
I'm Dorian, and I use the pronouns he, him. Are you comfortable sharing how you would like to be addressed?
Thank you for asking. I use they, them pronouns.
Great. Well, I'd love to hear more about your skill set.
Sure. I went to school for advertising
If you're teary-eyed, it's not just you, I promise. But what was done to be inclusive? The interviewer shared their pronoun, and they invited the persons to share theirs. Right? A really easy, simple action. What impact did it have? You saw the trans person just go, wow, I'm seen. Wow, I'm safe. Wow, I can really focus on thriving here as opposed to just surviving. And that's what inclusion is about. It's not about big, grand actions. It's those little actions that make a really big difference. And so, what are some 5 steps to increase safety in the context of occupational health and safety? The first one is educate leaders and employees, right? I think a lot of the transphobia that's out there, it's out of miseducation or misinformation. So educate leaders and employees. It's also important to just have a look at your systems and ensure that we have the ability to share our chosen name, even if our legal documents are not there yet. There's also a piece around reassessing coverage, looking at your benefits for trans people and ensuring that it does cover some of our needs. If you were curious, a lot of these surgeries cost upwards of $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, and public insurance does not cover it. And there are increasing number of companies who do cover at least part of it. There's a piece around all gender facilities, right? Men's washroom, women's washroom, where does everybody else go? There needs to be all gender facilities. You need to advocate for that. And last but not least, we need to establish a process to address harassment. Recognize harassment for what it is. It's not somebody just being politically incorrect. It's not just somebody just being old school. It's harassment. And if somebody is harassing a trans person, that needs to be addressed. Now, you might also be wondering, okay, somebody came out as trans. Now what? Right? First of all, congratulations. If somebody comes out as trans to you or in your workplace, that means that they feel safe. So yay, fantastic. First, thank them. Thank them for trusting you. Number 2, ask them what they need. Do they need support with changing their name in the system? Do they need time off for appointments? Do they need a different uniform? Right? Really ask them for what they need. Co-create a communication plan. So say, thank you for sharing this with me. Who can I share this with? If it's with nobody, then I understand. I won't share with anyone. But if you want me to share with your manager, I can. I can be part of the conversation. Let me know how I can support you with communicating it. Support their leader. Often what happens when somebody comes out is that their leader is afraid of making a mistake, so they start avoiding them. Support their leader. Let them know that it's okay to make mistakes. We're all part of a learning journey. Remember, we're moving along that learning journey. So it is okay to make mistakes, and they should not avoid the trans person just because they're afraid of making a mistake. And last but not least, check in often. Ask them, hey, how's it going? How are you doing? How's work? How's home? How are the pets? How's your partner? Etc. Checking in just reminds us that, like, okay, somebody cares about us. Even though the world might be telling us that we shouldn't exist, at least one person cares. And remember, all it takes is one person to help keep us alive. And so, with that said, I want to say thank you. Thank you for coming to this session. Thank you for all the reactions. I've been keeping an eye on them. And do stay in touch. We'll answer some questions now, but I want to encourage you to stay in touch. If you'd like some support bringing this topic to your company, I am happy to support you. And with that said, Sue, what questions do we got?
Well, thank you, Danny. That was amazing. And I have learned again so many new things today, so many supportive things. And yes, thank you for everyone for staying with us. So we will take some questions from the audience. We have some time that we will fit in what we can. So let's try this. How do you encourage employees to add pronouns to signature blocks and electronic meeting IDs so you know how to address someone?
Great question. So the question was, how do we encourage people to share their pronouns, whether it's in their signature and their Microsoft Teams, etc. I would say that it's about educating people on the impact, right? On the impact that sharing pronouns has, and also the impact of getting it wrong. So you may want to, for example, create a campaign that shares getting somebody's pronoun wrong hurts them, but also hurts your relationship. And so what can we do? Share your pronoun and ask for people's pronouns, right? When you share your pronouns, you create a space where less assumptions are made. When you share your pronouns, you create a space where less assumptions are made and therefore less people are misgendered. When we talk about the impact, I think that's what really gets people, because if you just say it's the best practice, it's the cool thing to do, people will be like, okay, well, I'm not cool or I don't care. But it's really talking about the impact and you've seen the impact. So talk about the impact that this has the potential to keep people safe.
Thanks, Danny. And there's one that sort of follows that. Best practice for asking names on a form. Should we be asking for preferred name or chosen name? I have heard, this is the audience writing us, that preferred is not a best practice. Do you have some comments about that?
Sure. So it all depends on what the purpose is. So in the context of the workplace, for example, my recommendation is ask for somebody's legal name and ask for their chosen name. And then when it comes to all the automatic communications that get built based on that, tie it back to the chosen name. I understand why some places still ask my legal name, right? It has to do with government records. It has to do with banking. It has to do with insurance. So I get it. And most trans people get it. However, what we don't want to see is our legal name everywhere where it doesn't need to be. We don't need to see it when we open a computer. We don't need to see it in our email account, for example. And so best practice, ask for the legal name if you have to, and usually you do, and create a space where you ask for the person's chosen name. And remember, it's not just trans people benefiting from this, right? There are plenty of people who use different names than their legal names. For example, Tomasa might be Tommy, etc. So a lot more people can benefit than just trans people. Great question.
Room for one more. And I think it'll help reiterate and bring on home so much of what you've shared already today. Someone who is identified as he or him for a decade now identifies as she, her. If I accidentally use he, him, what should I say to limit hurt? What a wonderful way of phrasing that.
Fantastic question. I love it. So the first piece that I have to highlight is that everybody makes mistakes, right? I mess up people's pronouns sometimes, and I'm trans. So what could that say for you and everybody else? I have to start there. We all make mistakes. It is impossible to be perfect here. However, we need to show up imperfectly. We need you to show up. We need you to keep interacting with that person, even if it means making mistakes once in a while. Now, what do you do when it happens and it's an accident, right? I recommend two things. So number one, let me say what not to do. What you don't want to do is, number one, ignore it, pretend it didn't happen. What you also don't want to do is be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. You're such a great person. I love you so much. You're so great. I am so great. I am so sorry. I promise that I'm a good person. Please don't hate me. You don't want to do that. You don't want to make a really big deal out of it. What I would recommend is, let's say, for example, you call them he for a second. She. Immediately correct yourself and move on. Now, if this is somebody that you have a close connection with, you may want to have a conversation with them. Say, hey, in case I mess up, what would you like me to do? Would you like me to acknowledge it afterwards? Would you like me to just correct myself and move on? So if it's somebody that you can have that conversation with, have it proactively. Say, when I mess up, if I mess up, how can I correct myself? Because I know that it hurts. And so I want to make sure that I fix it as soon as possible. I would recommend those two things. So number one, say, sorry, correct yourself and move on. And if it's somebody that's close to you, have that conversation to see how they would like for you to react when mistakes do happen, which it will. And we're human, it should.
Well, that's excellent, Danny. Also, one last one, I think it's a practical tip base. I've been wanting to approach my manager about making our washrooms all gender. Any tips?
Yeah, I think again, it's about highlighting the impact, right? And educating. So the way that I would have that conversation is say, there are people that are either in the workplace or coming into the workplace that don't identify as a man or a woman, right? And therefore, if there's only men and women's washrooms, they might not feel comfortable or safe going to either one. So this is about creating all gender washrooms. It's about creating safe spaces for everyone, not just men and women, because there's many people, especially upcoming generations, that are identifying many different ways. The other piece that I would add is it's now kind of a best practice. A lot of these new buildings that you're noticing, a lot of renovated buildings have all gender washrooms. So it is also a matter of staying current with the times and not being outdated.
Well, thank you again, Danny, and to all of you for being here today, for your participation and insights. So please take a few minutes to fill out the short survey that will open at a tab once the session ends and help make our future events even better. All registrants will receive a link to the recording of today's presentation in the coming days. Look for that in your inbox. If you haven't already, please sign up for tomorrow's session on how plain language helps workplace health and safety. A registration link has been shared in the chat, and if you have already signed up, we look forward to seeing you there. And so thank you again, Danny, all the participants for joining us, and bye for now.
Thanks, folks.